do you think that, do you need a microphone? One of each. I know, it's trickier. It seems they all stick together, don't they?
Yeah, they do.
Don't forget to plug off my phone.
No. I know.
Yes. No, we've got plenty. Oh, yes, good.
Okay. I'll do it.
Yes. How do they clip? It's a long time. I won't have a Gordon Brown moment in which I say something rude. You're okay with the introduction? Yes. I got back to the apologies because a few people are watching the American aftermath. Peter, have the beard is meant to be nice. The camera set off. Should be operating. Yes. You need a chair. Daniela Fountain. Dr Daniela Fountain.
Good evening and welcome once again to Beverley Minster for this latest in Marcus's lectures. For those of you who weren't here the other week or to the earlier ones, just to say that we don't sort of charge anything, but we would appreciate a donation of roughly £5 if you can manage that, because obviously there's the lighting and everything here and various other expenses that have to be met. So, as I say, this is the latest in a series that Marcus is giving. I'm just finding out, so I'm just going back, scrolling back to get my details of Marcus's. Marcus did his first degree at St Andrews University on church history before doing research masters at York in the early 90s on the Northern English bishops and the Anglo-Scottish Wars, which was really his subject for the first lecture. He then went to Cambridge for his MPhil and worked there as a tutor and research fellow for over 10 years. And he was researching a book on law and order in medieval Yorkshire, and this will be hopefully published next year. I hope you've got two pieces of paper. One relates to this evening's talk, but the other, I think perhaps almost the more important one, is to make sure you don't go away without having the dates of a further series of lectures given by Marcus in the new year. So now Marcus is moving us, as it were, forward a little bit in history to the Reformation period, which was extremely turbulent here in this part of Yorkshire, something called the Pilgrimage of Grace, perhaps the most serious of all the rebellions against Henry VIII and the Reformation changes. And I do know, because Marcus has told me, that so you must look out for it, listen carefully, that it includes tonight one of the great might-have-beens of Beverley history and the history of this minster. Marcus will speak as usual for about an hour, and then there will be an opportunity for questions and also for any further comments or contributions. So, Marcus, I hand over to you. Oh, I should have said, we also welcome now Daniela Fountain, who I think Marcus only met at the last talk and realized that she's a musician of this period. You see with her lute, so she's going to just sort of, as it were, put a little bit of her music of this period into Marcus's talk this evening. So welcome to both of you.
Thank you all so much for coming on a dark winter's night to Beverley Minster. I'm going to talk for an hour, and there will be a chance for questions and answers at the end. Just two things to add, and thank you for that warm introduction, Peter. I am also writing a book on the rise and fall of medieval Beverley to be published next year. And what I've been doing partly in these talks is so dreadfully selfish and self-publicizing of myself is actually I've been giving you a glimpse of each chapter of the book in advance. The chapters are 10,000 words long, the talks are only 5,000 words long, and it helps me in three ways. One, it's quite lonely being a writer, and you have to be quite disciplined and work to deadlines and be self-motivating. And there's nothing more self-motivating than giving a talk to 70, 80 people in Beverley Minster. Two, it enables me to get some feedback. So do ask questions, and I can work out which bits of my talk were good and which were rather dull. And third, of course, when the book is published, you'll have heard of it, and you might buy a copy. It'll be available in all good bookshops. Secondly, the list I've given you is of talks for next year, from January through to April. In addition to these, I've arranged with the Monk's Walk pub on each of the following Wednesdays after these talks to, free of charge, start a course called Poets and Pilgrims in the Pub, which is basically the Monk's Walk, in which we're going to look at the Canterbury Tales, read a Canterbury Tale each time, read stuff from the Carmina Burana, and other miscellaneous medieval secular poetry, which will also be free of charge, and like these talks here, all profits will go to Beverley Minster. So please don't think after tonight's talk there's nothing next. It would be great to see you at any of those. Now, decline and devastation, the Reformation and rebellion in Beverley. Most of this, some of this, is, like my previous talks, is all based on new research. New research largely from the state papers down in what was the Public Record Office in London. It's now the National Archives. So some of the things I'm going to argue tonight, in particular, one big thing which I was so excited to discover has not been published or discussed by historians before. And I have checked in every available publication, and I've had it double-checked by Professor Barbara English that what I say is correct, and I do acknowledge her assistance in that discovery, which I will come on in the middle of the talk. Professor Barbara English also kindly pointed out two things which made it rather topical. And I hadn't realized when I wrote this talk it would be so topical. Not only was last night bonfire night, when we remember two local characters, the last man with honest intentions to enter Parliament, Guy Fawkes, who was from York, born in High Petergate, York, and baptized in St. Michael the Belfry Church there, next to the Minster, but also his fellow co-conspirator, Thomas Percy of Beverley. Their attempt in the Gunpowder Plot to destroy the Protestant establishment is part of a future talk. It's the last on the list of the handout I've given you, but is also a direct outcome of tonight's. I'm also told by Barbara that the central part of my talk focuses on the desires and machinations of Thomas Cromwell, King Henry VIII's chief minister, who advanced the Reformation more than anyone else in political circles and at the royal court. And a new TV adaptation of Wolf Hall on the BBC is about to outline his downfall. Now, there's quite a lot to cover, so there's going to be some broad brushstrokes. But to begin with, let's look at the first half of my talk, decline and devastation. I'm getting used to the fact this is a clip-on mic and I can walk around. So, please tell me if it cuts out. So the secular reasons for Beverley's decline: economic and trading decline. What might have been thought to be a falling population, but surprisingly, despite this decline in the 16th century, Beverley's population doesn't particularly fall, which is a curiosity. It remains at around the 5,000 mark. The church does keep Beverley going economically in a big way, but Beverley's prosperity is largely dependent upon the wool trade coming from the Yorkshire Wolds and up in the North Yorkshire Moors, from Revo, Byland, other monasteries, and then exporting that wool as an inland port to the towns of the Hanseatic League in Europe. But the rise of Hull is gradually, bit by bit, cutting off that trade with extra tariffs, and also the rise of the West Riding wool towns and textile towns are increasingly bypassing Beverley by going through the River's Aire, the River's Calder, into the River Humber itself. And even York is now beginning to send its wool and its exports directly down the River Ouse and the River Derwent to the River Humber, again bypassing Beverley. But the Reformation and its impact on this building and other aspects of the church will show how much the church is intertwined with the economic prosperity of Beverley, but also the lives of its inhabitants on every single level, something which is quite difficult for us to imagine in the 21st century. Because every aspect of Beverley townsmen and townswomen's working and personal lives, their worldview, their education, their health and their social care, their access to legal advice, to support in the courts, their abilities to draw up a will, to get somebody to advise them over a boundary dispute with their neighbours before the courts, was affected by the role of the church, and in particular, Beverley Minster. So as I go on to tell you about the theological, spiritual destruction on the people's lives of Beverley when this Minster Church is closed down, that is only just touching the surface, because most of Beverley's population, most of England's population are illiterate. They can't read or write in English, let alone Latin, and they would be dependent on some poor chaplain or chantry priest in the Minster to tell them how to write a letter, how to draw up their will, how to actually settle a legal dispute in the courts. The Citizens' Advice Bureau of its day. And on top of that, in terms of their health, there were 4 hospitals in Beverley. Their education would be dependent upon Beverley. Even the maintenance of roads and bridges was undertaken by the church, partly to help pilgrims, but also, of course, to help merchants as well. And finally, of course, the church actually prescribed all the holy days of the year, of which there were so many, but it's not a spiritual point I'm trying to make. The term holiday comes from holy day. So your time off, having a holiday, depended on things like the Feast of All Saints, the Feast of St. John of Beverley. So once these are cut by the government, by Thomas Cromwell, then the state has just stolen your holiday. Now, when somebody came on and said, I'm going to improve your lives in an election, they'll probably get your vote if things like your holidays and stuff like that was up for grabs, as well as your employment. The Archbishop of York also was the liege lord and the owner of Beverley. And Beverley in the Middle Ages was known as the Liberty of Beverley. It didn't just include the town, but it included the villages of Ticton, Molescroft, Woodmansey, Ralph and Wheal, a bit like it does today. And within that, it had its own courts, it had its own gallows, it had its own coroner. Even the vicar of Beverley, the provost of Beverley Minster, had his own gallows just over there in the field, of Hallgarth, and he had his own coroner and his own enforcement of the law and his own prison. So the church permeated everywhere. Beverley was exceptional in how powerful the church was, to such an extent that actually the powers of the archbishop were almost not so dissimilar to the prince bishops of Durham in their palatinate, almost a state within the state, in which the king's coroner could only enter with the archbishops of York's permission. So Beverley is exceptional even by English standards. One other point I want to make out that Beverley is spectacularly wealthy, with a population of over 5,000, declining a little bit in the 16th century period. It is not just the second biggest and second wealthiest town in Yorkshire after the city of York, it is actually the second biggest and wealthiest town in all of northern England. More important than Newcastle or Carlisle or Durham. In fact, bigger than anywhere in Scotland as well. So north of the Humber, Beverley on its own is wealthy. But if you also include its neighbours, Cottingham is the third wealthiest town in the East Riding, which is the breadbasket of East Yorkshire, and Hornsey is the fourth, and Hull, of course, nearby. This forms part of a golden triangle for the north of England. One historian comments that Beverley Minster was one of the wealthiest churches in one of the wealthiest towns in England. It's quite hard to realise that today. A lot of that wealth came from the pilgrims, but it also came from the merchant ships sailing down from Beckside, which is developed by the Archbishops of York as a sort of canal in its own right in the Middle Ages, down to the River Humber and out to the Hanseatic League. Now, as I outlined in my talk last week, those ships which are coming out of Beverley are carrying cargoes of 2, 3, 4, anything up to 800 or 900 pounds in medieval money, which you can multiply by at least 1,000, and you're talking about cargoes per ship going out of £500,000 to £1 million in today's money. Now, the earliest eyewitness description of Beverley we have comes from a man called John Leyland in circa 1540. Leyland was the keeper of King Henry VIII's libraries and became the king's antiquary and historian. And he toured for almost a decade throughout England and Wales, searching for old documents, books, and manuscripts. And he wrote a detailed description of what he saw in his itinerary. As he went round, the dissolution of the monasteries was just coming towards its end, and the collegiate churches and hospitals were about to follow. And he was appalled to see how many manuscripts, books, and libraries were being wantonly destroyed. He talks about how they were just given away for people to make, patch up the holes in their walls or patch up their fences with bits of an illuminated manuscript that they couldn't read. To such an extent in his travels that John Leyland actually went mad himself. He ended up being declared insane. But we do have his itinerary before he went mad. His description of Beverley follows: the things I noticed in Beverley: the collegiate church of St. John is of a fair uniform making, wherein, besides the tombs of 3 saints, not just St. John of Beverley, by 3 tombs, most notable on the north side of the choir, one of them in a chapel with an arch over it, is buried Percy, Earl of Northumberland, and his son, father to the last Earl. In another is buried Eleanor, wife of one of the Percys, and in another of white alabaster, Idenia, Lady Percy, another wife of the Percy. And then he makes this curious reference, which nobody seems to have picked up on that much. Under Eleanor's tomb is buried another one of the Percys, who is a priest. The prebendary houses stand around St. John's churchyard. This is the Minster, St. John of Beverley. It's actually St. John the Evangelist, actually. And whereof the Bishop of York has one which is moated, but it is now all in ruin. The fairest part of the provost's house is the gate and the front. There is St. Mary's Church at the north end of the town, large and fair, and cruciform in shape. In the town were of late 2 houses of friars, the Black Friars and the Grey Friars. There are 4 hospitals in the town. He goes on to list their foundation, and these include the Hospital of the Holy Trinity, which stands in the heart and still runs, a Hospital of St. Nicholas by the Black Friars, which is the Dominican Friars, but that is decayed. There is another hospital yet standing hard without the North Bar Gate, founded by two merchantmen. And I remember there is an image of Our Lady over this hospital gate. And there is a house also of the Trinity on the east side of the town. The town of Beverley is large and well built of wood, but the fairest part of it is by the north, and there is the market kept. There was good cloth making at Beverley, and Beverley was famous for its burnet, a particular type of brown-coloured cloth, but that is now much decayed. The town is not walled, but there yet be many fair gates of brick, North Bar, New Bigham Bar, and Kelgate Bar. Now, interesting, those references, even by 1540, continual references to the town showing elements of decay. Beverley had actually been in a slow but steady economic decline since the mid-15th century. It had reached its high point during the reign of King Richard II in the late 14th century. And the immediate causes of this had been, as I outlined at the beginning, the sustained and systematic growth of Hull, which also led more merchants to move from Beverley to Hull itself, with the wall being expected from York and the West Riding, going direct into the Humber and bypassing Beverley, and the rise of the West Riding as the market towns of Leeds and even Bradford, Halifax and Dewsbury were developing. But there is also a change going on in the world, not just in Beverley and Yorkshire, which is affecting Beverley. Because the discovery of the Americas and the New World by Christopher Columbus in 1492 meant a growing importance of the west coast of England at the expense of the east, as transatlantic trade began for the first time in the 16th century and would continue to grow in importance throughout the next centuries and until today. So much so that the population centres of England would shift gradually westwards. And another topical thing, given we've just had the American election results, you can thank America for one thing which Europe had not really experienced before as a result of the discovery of the New World, and that is inflation. Inflation did not exist in the Middle Ages, but from the 16th century on, as new commodities, not just in gold from the Aztec Empire, but also foodstuffs, even later on with the arrival of the potato, will create inflation for the first time ever. And inflation in Tudor England would skyrocket. It would skyrocket out of control. Henry VIII and Edward VI, even after all the money they get from the dissolution of the monasteries and seizure of the church's assets, which is staggering and would make him the wealthiest king in Europe, but partly because of squandering it, but also because of inflation, Henry VIII will die practically bankrupt. And Edward VI will then desperately have to look, or the Duke of Northumberland over him, will have to seize the collegiate churches, such as Beverley Minster in 1548, because there isn't much left to nick off the church. But he will have to do it. Now, despite this, Tudor Beverley does still, and I'm still wondering why, maintain a population of 5,000 or so. Still the second biggest town in Yorkshire. A decline in population would not take any dramatic form until the mid-17th century, when it would nearly halve the prosperity and the population of the town. However, people in Beverley were aware throughout the 16th century that Beverley's great and wealthy days were over. To make matters worse, towards the end of my period, Beverley would suffer two particularly nasty outbreaks of plague in 1576 and 1590, and would suffer at least 2 or 3 more in the first decade of the 17th century. In the late 16th century, towards the end of my period I'm looking at tonight, Beverley increasingly pleaded poverty in the payment of taxes to the crown, and in 1599 was granted a dispensation from taxation due to poverty. The town then paid £105 a year, well over £1 million in today's money, alone towards the relief of the poor and the indigent of Beverley, many of whom were unemployed, and the town council had to support 80 orphans. Perhaps most shockingly, no less than 400 houses were said to be in either advanced decay or in ruin and were uninhabited. Now, even allowing for exaggeration and hyperbole, of which there would certainly be a fair bit if you're trying to get a discount on your taxes, it is clear that decline had hit the town hard and devastation was not far off. So it's against this background, this backdrop of nearly a century of slow economic decline, which originated in the 1450s. So historians previously had thought that the decline had come towards the end of the 15th century, but new research has shown it is a little bit earlier. York is also entering into the beginning of an economic decline from the 1450s onwards. It's behind this background that the English Reformation took place. It is no surprise, perhaps, that the greatest rebellion King Henry VIII ever faced, indeed the greatest threat to royal authority throughout the entire Tudor age, throughout the 16th century, had its early origins in Beverley. This was called the Pilgrimage of Grace in 1536 to 1537. The religious changes that Henry VIII had brought about in 1534 to secure his divorce from Catherine of Aragon and to marry Anne Boleyn hadn't actually had any impact upon the lives of ordinary people. Neither had the Act of Supremacy either. It was only when the King's then Chief Minister, Thomas Cromwell, an ardent, even zealous Protestant, whom from childhood had a personal, deep-rooted hostility towards monks and nuns, began the closure and the destruction of the lesser, smaller monasteries with an annual value of less than £200 in the summer of 1536. Only then did the ordinary people of Beverley and elsewhere take note and took afraid. And one of the very first religious houses to be closed down was poor Nunburn Home near Pocklington, the poorest religious house in all of Yorkshire, worth only about £12 a year. And neighbouring to Nunburn Home, it was quickly followed by the closure of Water Priory. As well as closing down the smaller monasteries, it was quite difficult to know what to do with the nuns, because you could just turf out the nuns that easily, and they were a bit more sensitive. Also, all the nuns' houses were far poorer than the male monasteries. So Nunburnham is closed, but other places like Swine, which is just up the road, which is actually one of the wealthiest nunneries in northern England, and Nunkeeling, a bit further up, remain open, as does Wilberforce, where I grew up as a child. And the nuns of Nunburnham are then sent off to stay at these monasteries, which won't actually close until the very end of the dissolution, 3 years later. But monks and nuns were people's brothers and sisters by blood. They were people's nephews and nieces. They had parents and grandparents, uncles and aunts. They knew the people of not just Nunburnham, but Pocklington, where they came from. They knew the people of Beverley. They had families there, and they had grown up and played with other people. So these are your friends and family who are being rendered homeless on a pitiful pension. And one can imagine the impact that this would have had. The population of England in the 16th century is at best 5 million. It hasn't still recovered from the after effects of the Black Death. But 1 in 20 people, 5% of the entire population of England, are in some kind of holy orders. They are either priests or canons, or they are monks, or they are nuns, or they are friars, or they are hermits, or they are anchorites, or they're in lower orders, acolytes, readers. So 1 in 20 people, 5% of the population, are involved in the church. So everybody knows somebody whose future is being completely thrown up in the air by Henry VIII. The destruction of Numburnhome and water led to rumours quickly beginning to spread throughout the East Riding and Northern England that not only would all the smaller monasteries be inevitably destroyed, but the greater ones would inevitably follow: Whitby, Rievaulx, Fountains, St Mary's, Jervaux, Bridlington. And that this was a state-sponsored policy for the financial ruin of the church. And in time, it would not just be the monasteries, it would be the end of shrines for healing, pilgrimage for travelling, holy days, which, as I talked about, served as holidays for ordinary people, and in time, even the local parish church itself might be threatened with despoliation. Where would it end? And believe me, as we know, it wouldn't end until it really, really has ended. You know, by Edward VI's reign and Elizabeth I's reign, they're even trying to take the last church bell and the last chalice and the last plate from even a small parish church and melt it down and take it away. Part of this is a Protestant reformer's zeal. Part of this is also a way to make a tremendous amount of money, an asset strip, even the parish church and the small chapel, from popular use. There is a PhD waiting to be written by somebody, and I hope somebody does do it one day, is that the dissolution of the chantries, this church, Beverley Minster, would have had about 9 different chantry chapels. A chantry chapel was basically you left money for a priest for life to say masses for the repose of your soul after you died and for your loved ones, and that would help get you through purgatory and into the kingdom of heaven. Now, I'm not here to discuss the theology of it, but they were very popular, and it was your personal sort of family thing. But also these chantry priests, who only had a meagre amount to live on, probably about minimum wage, about £5 a year, did actually go out, and they did all the hard donkey work in the parish to actually make some extra money. So they would go and hear your confession, but also write your will for you, and you'll dictate it in return for a shilling or a couple of pence. They'll help you in the courts with that boundary dispute with your neighbour, but also they would look after the people in the surrounding villages. Molescroft and Woodmansey are dependent upon this little chapel, which we know exists as a chantry chapel, and then just disappears. It's so poor that even King Henry VIII's commissioners never record its value. But there are loads, there are dozens of these little tiny village daughter churches and daughter chapels where people have services, where they get baptized and married because it's too far to come to the minster. These all just disappear as a result of the Reformation. And they're swept away. So that's the PhD to write what happened to the little daughter chapel at Molescroft, or at Fern, or at Wheal, or at the hamlet of Newton upon Derwent by Wilberforce. Other places, there are hundreds of them. And they're not chantries, they're not monasteries. They just disappear. And historians just conclude, well, they just went with the Reformation. Nobody really knows how, why, or when. So rumours quickly begin to spread. And rumours, of course, quickly grow. And they're quickly followed by protests and disturbances. And in the case of the Pilgrimage of Grace, this begins in neighbouring Lincolnshire. But at the moment, it's just the odd riot at most, a bit of a disturbance. It's disparate and it's uncoordinated. And it is a popular, spectacular uprising, which begins largely in the Lincolnshire town of Louth. The uprising becomes much more serious when Beverley gets involved. Now it changes from just being a few disgruntled agitators and rioters. It now breaks out into what could be actual civil war. It certainly will be outright rebellion. And it begins in Beverley on Sunday, October the 8th, 1536, 6 days after the start of the Lincolnshire Rebellion, and exactly a week after the citizens of Louth have locked up their church to prevent the confiscation of its treasures by the king and his agents. So incited and inspired by the Lincolnshire example, Beverley became the first revolt in the north of England to form actually a host of armed men intent on marching for justice. A host which was initially placed under the captaincy of a man from Beverley called William Stapleton, a common lawyer. And eventually it would be led by the knights Sir Thomas Percy, Sir Ralph Elliker the younger, and the younger Sir William Constable from the Everingham family, and also from the Burton Constable and elsewhere. Essentially, however, the uprising was, as it claimed to be, a movement of the common people. It became a considerable insurrection, partly because the gentry of the East Riding either fled or remained passive, and partly because the surrounding areas, Holderness to the east and the Yorkshire Wolds to the west and the north, for in this way it became an uprising through the support to those areas of the wapentakes of Harthill and Holderness. A wapentake is basically an area which in medieval terms, the nearest equivalent would be a district council when they existed. It's a local government area. But Harthill includes basically Driffield, Pocklington and Market Wheaton, down to Hunsley Beacon, and then Beverley is an independent liberty sandwiched between Harthill and Holderness. Having formed a confederation, bound by oaths to be true to God, to be true to the king, you can make sure as your own protection you get that in whenever you think of the king, and to the commons, the Pilgrim of Grace in Beverley created an army with the intention of going forward, hoping to aid the disturbances in Lincolnshire. However, from the 15th and 19th of October, it became fully occupied in successfully besieging and capturing Kingston upon Hull. And by the time Hull was captured, the Lincolnshire rebels had been fully subjugated by their own gentry. Instead, the Pilgrimage of Grace, starting from Beverley, linked up with other uprisings throughout the rest of Yorkshire and sent its army, marched from Beverley, to join these others from the north, Yorkshire, and from the west, to join at the city of York with an entire pilgrim host, which amassed a force of 30,000 men. An army of 30,000 men that would march from York to meet and petition the royal Duke of Norfolk, who has an army of only 11,000 men, at Doncaster on October the 26th. Now, I'm not going to have time to outline the entire Pilgrimage of Grace. The leading study is by Michael Bush, Manchester University Press, also probably available in, well, probably on eBay now, actually. It was published in 2000, so a bargain price of 50 quid. It's cheap for an academic book. But that is the leading definitive study of the Pilgrimage of Grace. It was his PhD. But today I'm just going to focus on Beverley's immediate involvement. The Pilgrimage of Grace in Beverley, in many respects, like all good things, began in the pub. In particular, the Tabard Inn. And it's the only reference we have to the name of a pub in Beverley, and it's called the Tabard Inn. A couple of days of agitated talk had spread throughout Beverley after townspeople reported seeing the beacons of Lincolnshire being lit as a warning and a call for aid on October the 4th. I hope that you've seen the Lord of the Rings and the Return of the King film when the beacons are lit, a Gondor calls for aid, and you see that wonderful dramatic picture through the mountains of a series of bonfires being lit. It's the early warning system. Well, this is what's happening in the flats of Lincolnshire, and it has been seen by the people of the East Riding. Now, they know that there isn't an invasion coming, but they do know that Thomas Cromwell and Henry VIII wants to steal everything from the parish churches of St. Mary, St. Nicholas, and they know that Beverley Minster is under threat, and they have seen what's happened in Dunburnholme and in Water. They're also incited by the publication of a letter from the Archbishop of York, who was Lord of the Liberty of Beverley, had warned his receiver, Robert Creek, to watch out for light hotheads in Beverley bent on rebellion. A rumour also spread that the Earl of Shrewsbury was on behalf of the king planning a military crackdown on the people of Lincolnshire and then moving into the East Riding to make sure disturbances don't repeat themselves there. Another cause of agitation in the town was the arrival of agents provocateurs from Lincolnshire, notably two priests, Sir John Boughton and Sir William Maud, who were first encountered on the 7th of October at Hessel, the landing on the Yorkshire side of the Humber for the Barton Ferry, now the span of the Humber Bridge, and they had a letter with them, authorising their journey into Yorkshire, addressed to all our true friends of Beverley from several of Lincolnshire's leading gentry families. Now, this is the first message received in Yorkshire that denoted that the Lincolnshire uprising wasn't just a bunch of hotheads, but it was being led by the local gentry. And arriving at the Tabard Inn in Beverley, these two priests, Sir William and Sir John, got a bit tipsy, deliberately, and spoke rather loudly, and showed them their letters. They declared that the Lincolnshire host was a good company, nudgingly over a pint, saying, "It is regrettable that they are not more in number." It's not the case. You are true good friends, and this is the wealth of the Holy Church, your church, which is at risk. Later on, trying to save his neck from the hangman's noose, we know, of course, that the pilgrimage of grace will fail. But in the court cases, examining what happens, we can extrapolate back. And in reporting in those cases to save his neck, one William Breyer, a roving ex-sanctuary man of Beverley and convicted felon, recorded the talk of the town. And he related how men in the marketplace had excitedly, in the Saturday market, discussed the prospect of a march on London, which would allow them to sort out deceivers such as Cromwell, and for good measure, to rob Cheapside. When you go on a trip, you're going to take something back with you, I suppose. If you're going to risk treason, you might as well see it. Is Cheapside, is that the bit of London on the South Bank? I don't know my London geography. But anyway, this is certainly recorded. Oh, I've just lost my place. It was not simply the townsmen who were worked up. In the marketplace, another man told Breyer that all the countryside hereabouts in Beverley is in a rout. And at the Tabard Inn, Breyer said he overheard a gentleman from Holderness saying that if the Lincolnshire men needed support, they could be sure of it from all of Beverley, all of Holderness, and all of Yorkshire. The following day, the uprising began with the ringing of the town or common bell. This followed the arrival of William Woodmansey from Lincolnshire, with further news of that rebellion there, hasn't been dissipated yet, and a copy of its articles. They had written down a series of demands. On top of that was an end to the dissolution of the monasteries and the restoration of those that had already been closed. In addition, there now came to light a letter sent earlier to one of Beverley's 12 governors, Robert Raffles, one of Beverley's town council, basically, at the time, from Robert Aske of Orton, near Weldrake, near York. And it is Robert Aske who will become most famous as the principal leader of the Pilgrimage of Grace. and its spokesman personally to King Henry VIII, and this letter from Robert Aske provided clear instructions on how to mount a rebellion. It's a bit like, I suppose terrorists. You download how to be a good terrorist guide from the internet, how to mount a rebellion in the 16th century. And these are the instructions, how to mount a rebellion. First, you start off by ringing the town bell. And then you get everybody who comes to it, because you have to turn up when the town bell goes, to swear an oath of allegiance to a series of articles of grievance and to the common good. And then thirdly, you muster an army, and you make sure you do it in the open, and you do it publicly so everybody knows. Now, in the aftermath of the revolt, later on having failed, and let's face it, Robert Aske is an honest man. There are other motives involved in the Pilgrimage of Grace apart from the dissolution of the monasteries, but it is probably the most principled rebellion that ever takes place in all of English history, to be honest. It is ultimately a failure due to the outright duplicity of King Henry VIII, who will promise to the rebels that he agrees that they've been hard done by. He will stop the dissolution. He will have a parliament in York. He makes sure that it is in York. He will restore all these monasteries. They will all be okay. I'm sorry, I went too far. I'm a good, true Catholic. Look, I haven't made any changes to your worship. We still have the Mass. And then he will quietly, completely break his word, because, let's face it, Henry VIII is increasingly a bit of a psychopath. He has just chopped off 2 of his wives' heads, and he marries the 3rd on the same day. He makes sure that Anne Boleyn is executed. He's already executed Thomas More. He's executed pretty much, or ordered Cardinal Thomas Wolsey to be executed of York. I mean, he's got so much blood in his hands by this stage, and he hasn't even really started yet. So executing 214 rebels, but at the moment, the Duke of Norfolk, all he can muster is an army of 11,000, and there's 30,000 rebels, so I'll wait 6 months for you to trip up, and then I'll renege on every promise, and then catch you at home whilst you're asleep, thinking I'm going to be a good and honest king. And in that, we hear about William Stapleton, another man of Beverley, who becomes one of the leaders of the revolt here, but is pleading for his life and a royal pardon, which he gets after giving a revealing defense of his actions at the beginning of the revolt in Beverley. And I'm going to read it out to you. Early in the morning of 8th of October, the town bell was rung in Beverley Marketplace, and William Stapleton, on his brother's behalf, ordered all members of their family to stay inside Greyfriars, the Franciscan monastery, out towards the westward on the edge of the town, whilst one of their servants went to the marketplace to see what was happening. The servant returned and told them that a proclamation had been made for every man to come into Beverley and take his oath to join the rebels on pain of death, and that Richard Wilson, a town governor, with a copy of the oath drawn up in one hand and the Bible in the other, was swearing them in. Later, a call was made for every man to appear at Hall Garth, the manor of the Archbishop of York, just over there in that field where the cows are next to the Minster. After the proclamation, and after meeting at Hall Garth to receive the articles, every man was to appear on Westward Green near Greyfriars. There was a great noise, shouts and cries, until the men were told to return again to Westward the following day with such horses and harnesses and weapons as they had. And they keep reappearing every day for 4 days, the 8th, the 9th, the 10th, and the 11th of October, on the Westward, as they're basically being carefully drilled and amassed and resourced into an army. As they departed, Christopher's wife, despite her husband's injunctions, that's Christopher Stapleton, who's the brother to William Stapleton, who's one of the leading town councillors, who's pleading for his life. Despite her husband's injunction to stay indoors, went forth and stood in a close where a great number of the rebels were coming from either side of the hedges leading on to the westward, and said, God's blessings have ye, and speed you well on your purpose. They asked where her husband and relations were, William Stapleton, in particular they're looking for, and she replied that they were in the friary, that they were cowards, and that the people of Beverley should go and pull them out by their heads. I don't think her husband would have been very impressed by that. He was actually quite ill at the time, and to quote directly from William Stapleton's confession, his brother Christopher, when he heard of this, became more confused than ever and wished that he were dead. He asked her what she meant by disobeying his orders, and was worried that because of her behavior, he and his brother would be out of favor with the king, and his heirs would be, their children would be disinherited forever. And she answered, well, it's God's quarrel. Later, Christopher wanted to know the reason for the commotion and the unrest, and he was told that in Beverley, it wasn't just about the dissolution of the monasteries at Numburn and Water, but it also was a revenge on old grudges and quarrels and dissensions amongst the townsfolk caused by a rift between the Archbishop of York and the people of Beverley for their own rights. Some took the side of the Archbishop and some the town. One follower of the Archbishop was almost slain on the westward. Every man kept reassembling on the westward, and Christopher Sanderson and Sir Ralph Elliker came to Greyfriars to ask if Christopher and William intended to join the rebels. He said he was prepared to give them advice, but not to be sworn in, because he was sworn to be loyal to the king, and they couldn't agree. When this was reported to the rebels on the green, certain wild people felt they should go and burn the friary down, and all the members of the Stapleton family with them, and whilst others dissuaded them because of Christopher's illness. However, here we get an interesting reference of the amount of people involved. Now, I'm not going to keep going on with this quote. I've just realized I've already spoken for 45 minutes, and I'm only about halfway through my talk. But we're told that there are between 400 and 500 rebels amassing each day on the westward alone in Beverley, out of a population of 5,000. So that's 10% of armed young men, with horses and bridles and weapons. And they are now sending out parties to Cottingham and to Hessel to try to recruit even more. And then the people of Beverley themselves go off and decide to fire and light Hunsley Beacon. I think it's where there's a TV transmitter there at the moment, isn't it? It's over by Market Wheaton. That's the beacons for East Yorkshire. So Hunsley Beacon, there's never built a beacon at Wilton, at Bishop Wilton. There's the Home Beacon, there's the Bainton Beacon near Driffield. So this is actually sending off, asking all of the East Riding and spreading into the North Riding to come and rise up and come into open revolt. There's a reference that William talks about. He saw the murderous gleam in these wild men's eyes of Beverley, and he heard them shouting for him to be their captain, which he eventually agreed to. Now, in the end, I told you through the duplicity of Henry VIII, the Pilgrimage of Grace will fail in 1537, and at least 216 men were tried and executed for their part in it, including Robert Aske, and including several clergy, including the abbots of Jervaux, Fountains Abbey, the prior of Bridlington, the sub-prior of Wotton, just up the road, and several others. But in Henry VIII's scheme of things, 216 isn't actually that many. He actually pardons most people. All of Beverley gets a pardon apart from 2 people. And this comes on to the new bit of research, which I think is quite groundbreaking. Because part of this is that Thomas Cromwell is very mindful of the impact the dissolution of the monasteries is having. And he's an ardent reformer, but he knows, and he himself is a devout Protestant, he doesn't want all the money that's going from the monasteries just to be spent on new palaces for Henry VIII, or for founding the Royal Navy, which is where quite a bit of the money goes as well, or building castles. He actually wants to help the poor, genuinely. He actually wants to found schools. He wants to found up hospitals and orphanages. He wants to replace the welfare state that the church had organized before, get rid of the monks and nuns, but actually let's get rid of vagrancy and homelessness, and let's bring education to everybody and teach them to be good little Protestants for the future with their Bible. Thomas Cromwell genuinely believes in this. So, I need my glasses for this, but he actually comes up with an idea to create 6 new cathedrals. 6 new diocesan cathedrals out of the former monasteries. And he actually gets King Henry VIII to agree to this. Lots of historical discoveries are waiting to be found in plain sight. And here is from the National Archives, a letter which Barbara English herself has confirmed is in Thomas Cromwell's handwriting, called the New Bishoprics. And it's a series of documents with valuations and stuff. And it says 1, bishoprics newly to be erected by the King. Westminster, St. Albans, Peterborough, Oxford, Chester, Bristol, Guisborough, cum Beverley. Cathedral and collegiate churches newly to be made and erected by the King, Ripon and Beverley. Now, pretty much all of these do actually become cathedrals, and still are cathedrals to this day. Bristol, Oxford, Chester, Peterborough are still cathedrals from 1540. Guisborough cum Beverley, Guisborough with Beverley. There's a margin note next to Guisborough cum Beverley, and it says cancelled. Why? Now, I've been wondering this for a while. Now, creating 6 new cathedrals out of the 650 monasteries that you're going to destroy isn't that much. Why is Beverley cancelled? Why is that difficult? And yet the others go ahead. Because actually, logically, the other places, Bristol, Peterborough, Chester, are actually monasteries. They would be more expensive and more difficult to turn into a cathedral because they've got a bunch of monks. And you just got rid of monks. So you've got to pension off all the monks. You've got to clear away their refectory and their dormitory. Beverley, however, isn't a monastery. There are no monks to pension off. It's a bunch of secular priests, ordinary priests, canons. So you don't have to do anything. There's not lots of buildings to get rid of. You don't have to pension them off. You just change their name and turn the provost into a dean. Get in their chapter house to elect one of them to be the bishop. You get a cathedral for naught, a cathedral for nothing. There was a joke in 1992, a spitting image joke, and John Major decided overnight, I'm going to create 20 new universities. And I'll do it by taking all these former polytechnics and colleges of higher education and allowing them to change their name overnight to become a university. So that I can now double the university population. I'm not going to provide them with any more money or anything like that, but it's a way in which we can suddenly get lots of new universities. But, that was a spitting image satire. I mean, there was more to it than that. But here, Henry VIII could have had Beverley as a cathedral for practically naught. And he's linking it with Guisborough. Guisborough Abbey is up by Scarborough. It's still an English heritage property. There's not much left. There's one big, huge arch. And York, after Lincoln, is the biggest diocese of all. So it makes sense to carve out from Guisborough down to Beverley into a new bishop of Guisborough and Beverley in its own right. Scarborough basically down to Hull. Cover the Yorkshire coastline. And remember what I told you, that Beverley and Hull, Cottingham and Hornsey is the wealthiest part of Yorkshire. And I was trying to work out, well, how come it's cancelled at the last minute? Well, by very pure chance, I then came across something which I didn't realise or had overlooked, that in 1538, just a year before, 1539, was when Thomas Cromwell was drawing up this paper, Henry VIII passes what's called the Suffrage and Bishoprics Act and creates the first ever suffragan bishops. Suffragan bishops are assistant bishops. We have them today. We have Eleanor Sanderson, who's the Bishop of Hull. She's the suffragan to York. She's doing a confirmation here next Thursday. We've got a Bishop of Whitby and a Bishop of Selby. And they're basically junior bishops who do the donkey work for the Archbishop of York. They do the confirmations and the ordinations, stuff like that. Anyway, the first 2 suffragan bishops to exist are the Bishop of Hull in 1538 for York and the Bishop of Dover for for the Archbishop of Canterbury. And curiously, the first person to become the first suffragan Bishop of Hull is a man called Robert Purseglove, who happens to be the last abbot of Guisborough Priory. And this is the same time that Beverley gets cancelled and Guisborough gets cancelled as a cathedral in its own right. The Archbishop of York clearly wasn't happy about losing Beverley and Guisborough and losing Hull and losing Hornsey, losing the wealthiest parts of his diocese. But also, Abbot Robert Purseglove knew he was about to be out of a job because Guisborough Abbey is going to be potentially demolished. So he's kind of pulling machinations at the court, trying to get the best deal for his retirement as he possibly can. And it's put to him that we'll make you the first suffragan Bishop of Hull, and the Archbishop will support you against Cromwell, as long as we kick away this whole idea of making Beverley a cathedral in its own right, those upstarts who will take away all my money. And Robert Purseglove falls for this. He becomes Bishop of Hull, remains so, as a bit of a vicar of Bray until 1559, so he remains Bishop of Hull throughout Edward VI and Mary I's reign, but then finally decides he doesn't want Elizabeth I, so he resigns and refuses to take an oath of allegiance to Elizabeth I and goes off in retirement back to Guisborough to be a schoolmaster, where he dies actually 20 years later in 1579. I haven't worked out quite why Beverley is not re-established as a collegiate church, because curiously, Ripon was in that list as well. I will make 6 new cathedrals, but I will re-establish some collegiate churches, Beverley and Ripon. Ripon actually is re-established. It's the only church in the country which is re-established as a collegiate church, but not by Elizabeth, but by her successor in 1604 by King James I. And it still is a collegiate church to this day. Charlie Shefford, our curate, made an interesting observation in that what might have been that you might have been sitting in Beverley Cathedral, because it came that close to being Beverley Cathedral. It is a truth, almost an entire truth, that every cathedral city has subsequently gone on to become a university town or a university city. So, Charlie Shefford, our curate, pointed out, if Beverley Minster had become a cathedral, you would probably have a University of Beverley now. I think how that would have changed the fortunes of the town. Now, I have gone way over my time length, so I'm going to cut towards the chase. I'm sure you're all getting a bit fed up of uncomfortable chairs, but I want to conclude on a more poetic and prosaic note. The first 2 histories of Beverley, but before I go into that, I want to point out Beverley's decline might also be viewed as being twice on the wrong side of politics. Beverley does remain overwhelmingly Catholic, right up until the 1580s and 1590s. So much so, a curiosity, I just went and discovered that the Lady Chapel that exists today is behind the high altar. It's the retro choir. That's where the Lady Chapel, the most sort of Catholic bit of the minster, was. And Beverley Minster is closed down on Easter Day, 1548. It's bought initially for 100 quid, bargain, by Sir Michael Stanhope, who's one of the, who's the MP for Beverley, actually. Anyway, he doesn't last long because he gets executed in 1552 for his support of the Duke of Northumberland. But the Stanhopes remain fierce. The Stanhopes then actually sell off for 100 quid to the town, and then to Sir Michael Wharton, who becomes the owner of Beverley Minster and the owner of the Archbishop's Palace next door. And he demolishes the chapter house and part of the minster to sell off for stone to pay the £100, and gets the rest for nothing. His family chapel, some of the oldest post-Reformation monuments, are all in the Lady Chapel. It's almost the Wharton Mausoleum. And they remain devout Roman Catholics and keep remaining Roman Catholics right up until the Civil War, when Beverley also again falls, rather unfortunately, on the wrong side of politics, because Beverley's royalist. So Catholic in the 16th century, royalist in the 17th century, by the 18th century, you're going to be poor because of that. But the first 2 histories of Beverley were both written and published independently in the same year, 1829, written by George Oliver and George Poulsen. And this is well before modern historians have reassessed and studied the Reformation from a modern historical method, which is free of religious or political agendas or interpretation. Because most 19th century historians always saw the Reformation as a good thing. It was popular, it was welcome, the Roman Catholic Church was corrupt. No self-respecting historian today would even possibly argue that for a minute. They'll be shot down in flames. They'd actually argue the opposite. It was imposed, it was unwanted, it was resisted, it was unpopular. But even George Poulsen, although he condemns in his late Regency, early Victorian anti-Catholic prejudice, he condemns the Catholic Church as being full of superstitious and evil, abusive excesses. He betrays a much more sensitive thing when he talks about Beverley. And he writes this: "The dissolution of the religious houses was an act not of the church, but the state, by a king and by a parliament, of the Roman Catholic communion in almost all points except the supremacy, and confirmed by others of the same persuasion. The Reformation of Henry VIII, if it can deserve any part of so respectable a name, was disgraced by single acts of rapacity in its chief instruments. Henry was a remorseless tyrant who swept away the whole frame of monastic foundations, and his successor in the career of rapine, the protector Duke of Newfoundland, finding that ground preoccupied, had nothing left but to steal and confiscate the collegiate churches, most of which were devoted to purposes exclusively parochial, and the ill effects of this Reformation are sensibly experienced in Beverley to this very day." That's quite startling. The end of the Middle Ages is movingly written about, and I'm going to conclude with this paragraph, by James Anthony Froude, a 19th century historian, writing in 1856 in his History of England. And he's describing the end of the Middle Ages and the beginning of the modern world. "For now it is all gone, like an unsubstantial pageant faded, and between us and the Old English there lies a gulf of mystery, which the prose of the historian will never adequately bridge. They cannot come to us, and our imagination can but feebly penetrate to them. Only among the aisles of our cathedrals, only as we gaze upon their silent figures sleeping on their tombs, some faint conceptions float before us of what these men and women were when they were alive, and perhaps in the sound of church bells, that peculiar creation of the medieval age, which falls upon the ear like the echo of a vanished world." Thank you. Dr Daniela Fountain, who is a PhD graduate who did her PhD at Hull University on 16th century music and the modern cinema, a musicologist, so she does really know her stuff properly, and she does teach the guitar and other instruments in Beverley, is going to play some 16th century music genuinely of the period. And then questions and answers.
We'll come now to any questions or comments One of the things that absolutely fascinates me about this building at the time of the Reformation is how much actually of Catholic imagery does survive. And the most extraordinary survival is if you go into that sort of part behind the screen that sort of is canopied over and look into the roof of it, there is a carving of the coronation of the Virgin, which would take only a broom handle to have destroyed. So there's something about what survives here, and indeed all the figures on the Percy tombs, and I wonder whether some of the Percys managed to sort of save something of here, although of course we lost a lot. But if there are questions, I will come down and sort of put the microphone to your mouth so that everybody else can hear your question.
Sorry, you referred in the evidence that was given, you referred to a sanctuary man? What's a sanctuary man?
Beverley had a right of sanctuary which extended to about a sort of 2-mile radius of the town. Similar, Ripon and Durham and Howden also had sanctuary claims as well, but Beverley's was more developed. And basically, if you had committed a crime, no matter where you were, and people would come from all the country and you made it to Beverley, you could claim sanctuary. This meant that for 30 days, only for 30 days, you would be fed and looked after by the canons of Beverley Minster, who would also give you legal representation and legal advice. And you couldn't be arrested, even if you'd been a mass murderer. And they will do everything to try to get you off. But after 30 days, and you have to make no attempt to flee, then it's a slightly different story. Then you actually either have to go to the trial or you have to make some sort of oath, which means you'll stay in Beverley and you'll never leave, or you have to do what's called abjure the realm, which is basically go into exile at the nearest port, which would be Hull, and never come back again. But in many cases it was there for people trying to escape a debt, a financial crime, but there were cases of people coming to Beverley. There's an instance of a woman I gave about in my last talk, but one from Howden, who actually has murdered her child, and murdered her son, and she flees to Beverley and claims sanctuary, even though she's from somewhere near Howden, and she could have just gone to Howden Minster, which is only 5 miles away. But clearly she chooses Beverley because she's wanting to start a new life where she's not known. And it becomes quite clear from the evidence that actually she's unmarried, is out of wedlock, and the baby is probably an abortion or an infanticide was what really happened. So people could come to Beverley and claim freedom, but also so did mass murderers as well. So it was kind of a benefit and also a drawback. You're actually bringing about a third of the people who claim sanctuary are murderers. Another third are actually just people trying to run away from a debt. And this obviously means that the people who claim sanctuary in Beverley probably here aren't of the best character or their motives.
Next question.
Thank you, Marcus, as ever, very entertaining. I'm still fascinated by the fact that there is a Bishop of Beverley.
There is.
And the Bishop of Beverley, if I remember correctly, is based in Guisborough. No, well, the Bishop of Beverley is actually revived in 1872 as a suffragan bishopric. And it's Robert Crossthwaite, and he does it for about 40 years until he dies. So, and then actually, they revived the bishopric of Hull. For some strange reason, the suffragan bishoprics that Henry VIII set up are got rid of by Elizabeth I, basically because she doesn't want to spend money and just wants to take away their salaries. And the Victorians bring them back. And they bring back Beverley as a bishopric in 1872, but there's only ever one of them. And he lives about 40. You can even buy picture postcards of him, Robert Crossthwaite, on eBay. You can look under old photographs. And then they revive the bishopric of Hull and move it to that. But then, in 1993, the General Synod of the Church of England, to cope with those parishes that don't approve of the ordination of women as priests, sets up again another flying bishop called the Bishop of Beverley, and that does exist to today, but he doesn't live in Guisborough, he lives in Micklegate in York, at Holy Trinity Rectory. There used to be a great bookshop there, Ken Spellman's, opposite, but he's still there, and there's about 4 of those. And there is a Roman Catholic Bishop of Beverley, but that was then merged into Middlesbrough.
In fact, I think there's been a changeover, but the last Bishop of Beverley did actually preach here in the Minster, sometime just before COVID anyway. I remember being there on the Sunday when he was preaching. So they're technically known as provincial episcopal visitors, more commonly known as flying bishops.
But the Bishop of Beverley that Henry VIII and Thomas Cromwell was going to set up was going to be a diocesan bishop. That means a real proper bishop, not a Mickey Mouse bishop. He would sit in the House of Lords, he would have a mitre, you know, he would be just as much a bishop as the Bishop of Durham is. This is a seriously big bishopric. That's why it would have such a huge impact on the future of the town, and why you would probably ended up with a university.
It's worth noting as well, I mean, we missed out in the 19th century as well, because the other one that wasn't created in the Tudor times was St Albans, but it did become a full diocesan bishopric in, I think it was 1879, anyway, sometime in the 1870s, and is today, covers Hertfordshire and Bedfordshire. So we didn't get to be a full diocese then when St Albans did. There was somebody back here who was, yes. So I'll come.
What kind of relationship would this church have had with the residents of the old Dominican Friary, which is immediately 100 yards over the road from here and is well worth a visit? I have to say it is still operational for visitors today and is well worth a visit. Would there have been any kind of contact on a turn at all with the Dominicans?
Unclear in the Middle Ages. Certainly, by the way, in the 19th century, Canon Nolloth, who was the vicar of Beverley Minster, who was responsible for putting in all the statues at the West Front in the 1890s and 1900s, he bought up the friary and turned it into a curate's house for all his many curates for about 30 years in about 1900. In the Middle Ages, though, however, there were two friaries. There was the Dominicans at the friary, now the youth hostel, and the Grey Friars, which are Franciscans, both gone. But they formed part of what was called a custody, and they were independent, jealously independent of the Minster and of the Archbishop in many respects, and they were looked after by a Minister General from York. So they probably didn't actually get on that well together, Beverley Minster and the friar. And the friars obviously travelled around a lot, but they did operate a bit like a spiritual republic in their own right. And the friars often could be quite radical and quite controversial. In many respects, the friars, who only come into being in the early 13th century, form almost a reformation in their own right, because the friars, who are very, very popular with the people, genuinely think that the monks and the collegiate church of Minster is too wealthy and they're not poor enough. And they should take the examples of St. Francis and St. Dominic seriously, and they're too worldly. And the friaries were much poorer, which why Henry VIII was less interested in them. He was never really interested in something that wouldn't produce money for him. So he closes them mostly because they're troublesome rather than anything else. They resist the Reformation more than anybody else.
Thank you. Hi, can you hear me? In all of your talks, we've not heard anything about a place I've cycled past many times. In a Hull accent, it's Merks or Mews Abbey. How did that fit in?
Yeah, Mew Abbey, M-E-A-U-X, which has never really been properly archaeologically excavated, but it's a huge site. Mew is incredibly important. It's a very, very wealthy monastery. It's about the size of Revo and Byland. It's probably the wealthiest monastery in East Yorkshire, a male monastery. Augustinian, I think. Because it's so near to Hull, the entire monastery is destroyed largely to build Hull's blockhouse and Hull's castle and Henry VIII, so there's not even a single stone left. But there is a couple of chronicles written by the chroniclers in Mew Abbey, which are important primary sources. That's almost a PhD in its own right, and that would be another chapter in its own right. But I will be giving a talk about that at some point next year. You'll probably have to come back to me on that. But they are very, very, very wealthy monks. In Beverley, because monasteries, basically, if you want to find a monastery, you don't found it in a town, normally. The friars will go to a town, but a monastery wants to go and find somewhere in the middle of nowhere where there's nobody around. So for Beverley, the nuns go off to Swine, it's a tiny village, Peter knows well, or Nunkeeling, or Halton Price, which is by North Ferriby. Or if you want to become a monk, you go to Mew, or you go to Watton. So that's in the countryside.
You may be aware, I mean, and if you ever watched that series Digging for Britain, which actually is on at the moment, I think, they have excavated the site of one of the blockhouses, and there is, in fact, I've just seen only in the last couple of weeks, permission now to turn it into a visitor attraction. What they're going to do, I gather, is have the foundations, and then they're going to create sort of blocks using kind of mesh to give some sense of the scale and the shape of it. So it has been found, or I think it's the South Blockhouse. But yes, that's why there is absolutely nothing at all of Mew left. But there are a few stones in a garden if you know where to look.
Just a point of information. There was a chap from Hesel called Ken Bueller some years ago, whose family farmed near Mews Abbey, and he did several amateur excavations, but he wrote a couple of scholarly papers about monastic tile kilns, and he had quite a large collection of tiles from Mews Abbey. And on his death, I think they were sold to or given to English Heritage. So they do exist because I've seen them, and they were quite extensive.
I mean, it wasn't a spectacularly wealthy abbey in the King's Returns for the dissolution Mew. By the way, whilst we're on the subject of monasteries, which I haven't really talked about, but it is listed in my talks for next year, Thomas Cromwell did try to, for propaganda purposes, sort of, he literally did fix up the monasteries. And claimed they were corrupt, and they were all having children and child out of wedlock, and they were incestuous, and they did this and did that, and and all the things that they did about miracles were fake, because he was trying to blacken their names as an excuse, and he sent investigators deliberately to find that actually what was meant to be a miraculous statue actually had all mechanical engineering contraptions that made it move and stuff like that, and all these relics were false. But he was deliberately trying to set them up. But most of the monasteries they found in the East Riding of Yorkshire, you couldn't find anything wrong with them at all. And he was desperately trying. And I could mention a couple of quite rude things that which he does try. But in a couple of cases, he tries to accuse a monk of water priory. He tries to stitch up one monk of water priory with a nun from Nun Burnholm, which actually claiming that they had a baby together. And he also tries to sometimes make out that actually these monks are committing incest as well. And he tries to fix them, and it's those that aren't committing incest are sodomites, they're committing sodomy. But actually, when you look at it quite carefully, the definition of sodomy that he is using isn't homosexual sex, it's just simple masturbation. But somehow that's now become sodomy, and homosexual sodomy isn't made a crime until 1534. It's Henry VIII. It's the first time that homosexuality actually becomes a criminal offence. And that's no coincidence at the same time Thomas Cromwell is trying to fix up all these monks to accuse them of this. But the point I want to make is that most of the monasteries in East Yorkshire are innocent, except for one. And if you look at my talk on Wednesday, February the 19th, the naughtiest nuns in England, Beverley and Swine Priory. Swine Priory is off the scale of bad behaviour. These really are the wealthiest and worst nuns, and partly because lots of them are coming from the Percy family and the Neville families who hate each other, who are always trying to frame each other about who's going to become the Mother Prioress or the Mother Superior. And it is astonishingly how bad they are. So do come to that talk.
Right. And by the way, there's another interesting thing about Swine. I mean, it's actually where I first went to church. We used to live down there. Swine is one of the only 4 churches in England and Wales still worshipping within Cistercian walls, because most Cistercian abbeys were in remote spots and, of course, disappeared. But the Swine, there's Margam in South Wales, there is Home Coltram in Cumbria, between the Lake District and Carlisle, and Abbeydoor in, I think it's Shropshire or Herefordshire. But they are the only 4. So Swine is although it looks like a conventional parish church now, is almost unique in the country. But yes, no.
Just a small point, and I have no absolute knowledge of this, but from my time in local government, I have a feeling that if Beverley had become a cathedral, we would now be living in the city of Beverley.
Yes, it would. Yes, the city either time or you have a cathedral.
I mean, if you are a cathedral, then it's automatically a city, because of course you've got St David's in Wales, which is barely more than a tiny little town, which is actually a cathedral city, and it's very, very useful on things like pointless and quizzes like that, when they want you to produce names of cities beginning with the letter whatever it is. And of course the cathedral cities nearly always score much more lowly. People don't think of places like Ely and St David's as being cathedrals, but they are. So yes, it would indeed have been the city of Beverley if this had been made a cathedral.
And presumably the town council would become a city council.
Yes. Yeah. Any more questions? Sorry. Sorry, you need to speak.
How did Beverley escape with the cathedral so intact?
Well, that's partly because it wasn't going to. Michael Stanhope, who buys it in 1548, I find it incredibly ironic and a sick joke it closes down on Easter Day. Easter Day, the day of resurrection, we're going to close you and demolish you. Really, that really is rubbing it into the poor monks. But Sir Michael Stanhope buys it for 100 quid, and he does intend to pull it down and make a profit out of that. But because he doesn't get time, because he then gets executed for involved in politics during Edward VI's reign, and Michael Wharton of Beverley buys it off him, clubs together with 7 others. They raise 100 quid, but they haven't got 100 quid. So they managed to sell off bits. So the chapter house bit, where the toilets are, they demolished that, and they demolished St Martin's Church, which was a parish church, which was on that side of the Minster, and they sell that off, and they actually make a profit. They make 120 quid. So they've got 100 quid to pay off Michael Stanhope and 20 quid to share amongst themselves, and they get everything else free of charge.
Yeah. Exactly the same thing happened.
Yes,
exactly the same thing happened at St Albans, where the town bought the abbey. It knocked down. There had been a vast chapel on one side of St Andrew's, which had been the town chapel, but was now redundant because it got the whole abbey church, and they also sort of sold off, and of course were far more monastic buildings there, and they were all sold off at a profit. But very, very similar, parallel situation, basically, of a town buying the abbey church or the Minster church for itself.
You get a similar case in Howden. Howden is a Minster, and actually the chapter house that is in ruins. That's run English heritage, but the nave has survived as a parish church, but it's not as rich as Beverley. Yeah. Oh, Kirkstall, yeah.
I just want to mention Swan Church, touch upon that.
Swine.
When I went in there was a magnificent array of tombs in there. Hilton family, isn't it? Are the Crusaders?
Every time I've tried to be in Swine Church, and I've been there twice with Peter, it's been locked, and I've never managed to get in.
There is a key holder, I think, in the village.
I need to write a letter to the vicar.
Yes,
What did you have a question?
and also there are. Hang on. There are also some of the original nuns' choir stalls as well in Swine Church, which have some. They're very, very simple actually, but they are there.
I don't want to prolong the evening much longer, but you mentioned Beverley and all the men that assembled on Westwood and marched off, etc. How many people congregated outside York with Robert Aske?
Oh gosh, that's a good question. Well, we know that 30,000 is the strength of the army that marches from York to Doncaster. So there's 30,000 that assemble in York, and we know that there's at least 400 to 500 assembling on the Westward from Beverley, but that's not including Cottingham and Hessel, and they pick up people en route. So actually the pilgrims on their way to York from Beverley, one of the first things they do is actually restore and reopen Nunburnham Priory. They drag the nuns back and put them back in their little village. It's unclear if they restore Water Priory as well, but they then go on and gather more people from Pocklington, and they get people from Market Wheaton. They don't close down even though they go past at Wilberforce Priory, because that's not closed until 1539, and that's where the Dunburnham nuns have gone, but they pick up the Dunburnham nuns and send them back from Wilberforce to Dunburnham, and then they get to York. So it's very possible that the host from Beverley has at least doubled or tripled by this point. And Robert Aske, who becomes its main leader, is an East Riding man. He's from Orton by Weldrake, and Weldrake then is in the East Riding, and he would have known Pocklington and Market Wheaton and Beverley very well. He's also a lawyer. It's very clear that Beverley is the main leaders, and the East Riding is the main thrust of the entire pilgrimage of grace, which then does spread out from Yorkshire and does involve the Lake District and Northumberland as well. It's a northern English rebellion. Even in the 16th century and throughout the Middle Ages, there was always the concept, it's not just entirely religious, there always was a north-south divide.
I think that's probably, I'll take one more question if there is one, because I think it is. Sorry.
All right, I was going to ask about the rebels actually, but what I wanted to know was, did they come from all levels of society? And where did they get all those weapons? You said they were all weaponized, they all had the weapons. And was it males and females that joined?
Well, the rebels, well, it's always referred to as the townsmen, but one can never really be quite sure. That's obviously just used as a phrase. It's a good question. Does it include women or not? Don't know the answer to that. Really don't know the answer to that. Yeah, that's a very good question. I have to think about that. In terms of weapons, though, in the Middle Ages, in the 16th century, and my second talk about law and order, everybody's got a weapon at home, and everybody is skilled in the use of it. But that's because they use things like, you have to practice your archery ages 16 to 60 every Sunday at the butts to make you quite used to the army. But people go hunting, so they use knives, they use a crossbow to go and hunt rabbits. And for poaching, everybody's got an axe, everybody's got a war hammer, and they're trained in the use of them. And they have a crossbow at home. We aren't trained in the use of a knife, apart from cutting up a rump steak or doing the vegetables. But they will be skilled in lots of weapons around the house. And most weapons in the Middle Ages have a domestic purpose. A spear you can use for fishing, an axe to chop your wood, a war hammer to hammer nails. There's only one weapon which is only a weapon and can only be a weapon, and that's a sword. A sword doesn't have any domestic use, does it? That partially answer.
Just take one. I did see one last one, because it's getting late and it's getting probably getting cold as well.
Thank you. One of our neighbours was hoping to come this evening, but she couldn't. Is it possible to have the link, please, for her?
I'm told that Kathy Verger has live streamed today's talk.
Live stream, yes.
I don't think anybody could hear you, so... Peter, could you... It's on Facebook and YouTube. Right, yes, on Facebook and YouTube, on the Minster's website, there's a Facebook and YouTube link. I don't know which bit do you have to push to get to it, because this isn't a service or a sermon, is it? Okay. All right, so search for either YouTube or Facebook or Beverley Minster's own website. Tonight's talk should be live streamed on that for the first time, including Dr. Fountain's music. And I'm hoping that the next talks will be live streamed as well. I also had an email this afternoon through Facebook from somebody saying they couldn't come tonight. I don't know if it was you or your friend, and asked me to give this talk to Hornsea Civic Society next year, which I've just agreed to. I don't have a date yet.
Okay, thank you all very much indeed. And as I say, it does get cold begins to strike up after an hour or so. So thank you very much indeed for coming. And please make sure there are more copies. Please make sure you've got a copy of this list of further lectures next year. So because there's some very interesting stuff coming up in this. But thank you again to Marcus, and thank you very much for the music. Would you like to play us out, as it were?